Hey everyone, good evening and welcome to today's stream. Today we are going to be talking a little bit about, what I do as a writer for Dungeons& and Dragons Adventures. So, how's everyone doing? So if you're wondering why I have this hat on and my t-shirt's got this rather evil, sinister looking cat face. That's because I've been working on some projects involving lots of dogs and cats. Yeah. Um, Fan service. I suppose. Yeah. So like I was saying, I've been working on some projects recently, and this is part of the dungeon craft setup. So we have been working on a new title called The Cat's Paws, and this project is all about talking cats. Yeah, and about a city called Rokonian, and there are lots and lots of cats involved. You want me to Nia? No, I'm not. I'm not gonna go niaing and neoing and stuff like that. Not today. I see quite a few people have joined us on stream today, and yeah. So Dungeon Craft is a new, well, I would say a new program that was recently put into place by Adventurers League, and in the past season, in season 10 for Adventurers League, where Dungeon Craft was first introduced, I worked on a couple of projects for together with some other writers, and the most, I guess, the most recent one that I did was Bring to Bear, which was the third part in the series, called the Bear series or the Ursa Major trilogy, and yeah, so that series was had a lot of bear puns involved. The first title was Bear the Load, the second was Bear in Mind, and then we had Bring to Bear, and that really got me started on writing about animals and stuff. Yeah. Um, of course, I've also had a hand in consulting for several other projects as well, and I think that's really part of the fun, getting involved with so many different writers, so many different creators, and uh, designing all sorts of stories and all sorts of concepts. Yeah, and that's the most beautiful part of the collaborative process between writers and designers and all sorts of things like that. Yeah, so feel free to ask me any questions while I'm on air today, because this is an ask me anything question session, and I'm not gonna do any fan service stuff, so not on air. Uh, but if you have any burning questions about the writing process, about my workflow or my creative process, feel free to let me know, and I'll try to talk about it. Um, so one of the things I really like to do is that I like to watch a lot of movies and use that as inspiration for my work. And someone who comes from a background in film, that's probably one of the biggest inspirations in what I do. So as a film major, as someone who specializes in uh, studying Asian cinema, especially, I really really enjoy the work of some of the directors from Japan, from Korea, South Korea, a lot of Hong Kong cinema as well, and all these factor into what I write. So one of the upcoming projects I'll be working on as part of my latest work on Dungeon Craft in season 11 for Adventurers League is to create a very wuxia and xianxia inspired kind of story. And this is going to take place in the Dungeon Craft setup because Dungeon Craft is perfect for this. the fantasy settings of Chinese mythology, especially, are great and lend themselves very, very naturally to the process of designing fantasy worlds, especially very Fey-like concepts because of the way they're done. So, like in Chinese mythology, there are things like the Xian, which are the essentially supernatural entities that are of a more divine nature. There are the Mo, which are like awakened from demonic beings or beings that are more similar to awakened animals and awakened beings of that sort, as well as the Yao, which are more like nature spirits, like the Fae. So in these three concepts, they can gel really, really well together in the dungeon craft. And for those of you who play Genshin Impact, I guess you could call these beings adaptai, I suppose. And overall, I would say that this is gonna work very, very closely with the design that I have for this dungeon craft realm, this domain of the light uh, that I'll be writing for my main project for season 11. Of course, I've also been working on the little side project for dungeon craft for season 11 as well. That's about cats and dogs because but I really love dogs. If anyone's come to the NTP studio, you'll see a lot of plushies of like huskies and um, or wolves or other like dog-like pets. Yeah, way too many plushies. And you can see I'm wearing this dog hat right now, uh, this husky hat, and yeah, so I really love cats and dogs. And yeah, talking about the films that inspired the cat and dog adventure specifically, uh, so yeah, sleeping hat. So like I was saying, the cat and dog adventures are kind of stories drawing from a lot of influences of Japanese anime, and let's just say that they're also they're kind of weebish in that sense. So I'm kind of working on that because there's a lot of throwbacks, a lot of call outs to some of the more classical stories about detective fiction written by Japanese authors. Uh, if you're familiar with the work of Itogawa Rampo, who is which is basically one of the more well-known Japanese mystery writers, and that's one of the inspirations for that. I also really, really love the mystery stories, the escape style stories that are created um, by Japanese game designers as well. The Nonary games, that series is one of my favorite series, and I think for there are other mystery stories as well that are in that band, like kind of Danganronpa, yeah, Zero Escape, all this kind of adventures is very I guess VN style mystery puzzle style kind of games with the escape elements. I really love these, and they factor into the creation of cats and dogs adventures. So films and games are a really big influence on me, and I try to do what I can to work all those inspirations into my writing. Yeah. And of course, where Wuxia is concerned, where CNCI is concerned, I will always talk about the first film that I watched that really, really triggered my imagination and showed me how much Chinese mythology can be popularized, and that was Zoo Warriors of the Magic Mountain by Sue Hark, which was a late 80s which I saw in the late 80s when I was a kid. And that was really one of the first one of the most seminal works in ciencia, which is the genre of Chinese style mythology and fantasy. And that was really, really inspiring. By today's standards, it'd be incredibly campy. Let's just say that that if we look at it now from a conventional viewer's lens, we would say that it's so dated, it's so ancient, that special effects are so, last century. But it is, and it remains one of the most important works in film history for the CNCR genre. And I mean, I guess my fascination with film, my appreciation for film, is also due in part to the fact that I majored in film history and film and fan studies when I was in university. And one of the professors that taught me in school was probably the most authoritative figure in Asian cinema ever, and his specialization was in wuxia. So we used to just hang out and chat about wuxia all the time, and that's been a really big influence in my writing as well. And that's something I want to show in my upcoming work about wuxia and ciencia that will be taking place in the upcoming Dungeon Craft series. Hey Corgi, I see Corgi's joined us. Corgi is a DM, I believe, from the Philippines, and we have played a couple games before, so welcome. So yeah, so feel free to ask me any questions as we go along. I'm happy to talk about it. If you have any questions about Dungeon Craft, or if you intend to work on Dungeon Craft, um, we can work it out. So Firon just said something in Chinese. 在下是 Firon, 阁下何人也? Wow, your Chinese is much better than mine. I can read that, but I think it's probably easier for us to speak in English because on the stream, because we're all here, and we have an international crowd, and we definitely want to make sure that we use the most common language as possible. Yeah, but yes, definitely a lot of Chinese concepts in my work that's going to be coming up. And yeah, so if you want to, yes, I kind of really enjoy the idea of just hanging out and chatting with people about the stuff I do. And okay, Firon has some questions. Go ahead, please. Feel free to share. And let's see, what's the difference between designing for tier one and tier two? That's question one. Two, is it okay to reflavor creatures in this new WBW while beyond the Witchlight while keeping to the rules of CR? And three, can I add conditions to the win loss of the combat to spice things up? Four, from your experience in designing for modules, do you think a linear story or a complex story is more popular? Five, in your opinion, how to make combat deadly with just two monsters without locking the players away for their turns? Oh wow, that's a real mouthful. So yeah. So first off, let's answer question one first. This is gonna be so I might be rambling a little bit, and if I do, pay no mind. Uh, so when you're designing for tier one and tier two, the most important thing you need to think about is what resources are available to the players. Yeah, so you need to understand what's available to the players, what kind of abilities they can bring to bear, and what kind of spells or what kind of items they have on hand for them to utilize, right? So in tier one, obviously the characters are going to be a little bit more squishy. They're going to have limited resources. Yes, there was a bear pun. No pun intended. Bear maybe. And because they are going to be a little bit more squishy and they have very limited resources and limited abilities that they can use in combat and in resolving various situations, uh, it's actually going to be a bit more challenging for them. So, like in tier one, it's the best tier to run a mystery story because they don't have access to things like Speak of Dead, for example. So, if you wanted to do a murder mystery and someone has access to Speak of Dead, that's just going to blow holes in your story because why? They can just question the spirit of the dead person, right? Or if they have divination spells, which are going to be really helpful and again accessible in tier two. And when that happens, they're going to just cast some magic, and all the all the little plot points that you want to obscure are just going to be presented out there. It's going to be available, and the players are just going to be able to solve the mystery really, really quickly. So that's tier one. Tier one, you have less resources. You're gonna have to be a bit more creative, and when you have those um, limited resources, you're gonna have to want to use them a bit more effectively. So this encourages players to think out of the box. In tier two, players have a lot more available to them. They'll have a couple of magic items as well. Don't forget that in Adventurers League at tier two, you can use up to 3 magic items per character. At the same time, they have access to spells and they have access to abilities that can really change the way the game is played. Contact Other Plane, for example. I always talk about Contact Other Plane. It's one of my favorite spells, and it's really the best spell for you as the DM to determine if the players are thinking creatively or not, and at the same time, whether the players are able to ask the right questions or not. So this is a thinking man's kind of spell. Yeah, and if you play a wizard and you want to be as creative as possible, casting spells like Contact Other Plane is one of the ways that you can try to solve a mystery as it takes place. So, or like I said, just now, Speak of Dead is a good example of a spell that will really mess up a murder mystery because they can simply question the dead person, right? And there is no better mystery than a murder mystery because that is the most important plot point. There's always a stake. So you have that. You have movement spells as well. So things like Dimension Door. You get things like water walking, water breathing, stuff like that. So that's going to change the way you play the game. You get Fly. Fly is a common spell that also changes the way you play the game. Yeah. So think a little bit about that when you're writing for the higher tiers. So that's the difference between tier one and tier two: resources and the availability of solutions. So if you want to challenge players at higher tiers of play, you want to make them exhaust their solutions or force them to think creatively in the use of solutions. Right? So that's for the difference between tier one and tier two. As for whether it's okay to reflavor characters or creatures, I would say that yes, to some extent, it's perfectly fine for you to reflavor. Um, Generally, if you want to reflavor something and it does not have a mechanical benefit, it's not a big deal. But where it comes to stat blocks, you cannot change anything in the stat block. So nothing in the mechanics portion of the character can be changed. So you could say, for example, Mr. Smith, the apple keeper. And Mrs. Smith, the apple keeper, could be a summer eldritch, for example. So if you write it down in the module, Mrs. Smith is gonna be listed as Mrs. Smith in bold letters as part of the format, in brackets, a summer eldritch, and that is the call out to the character stat block in where you list it in your monster entries at the back of the appendix. And you can talk about how Mrs. Smith dresses in maybe a floral dress with a sun hat and an apron that looks like an ungodly shade of rainbow or something. And that's perfectly fine. But remember, no mechanical changes. Can I add conditions to the win-loss of the combat to spice things up? You certainly can. Environment effects are perfectly okay. So if you think about it this way, environment effects are a great way of enhancing the overall scenario, and you can always put in certain ways of adding a win or loss condition, like say maybe they're racing against a clock. This is something I've done in quite a few of the adventures I've written so far, and in the latest one that hit the DC program, Bring to Bear, there's actually a race against the clock. So if you want to take a quick look at that, that's entirely possible. Give it a quick glance, and there are some examples there. So that's one of the ways that you can work on this. And I don't see a problem with that at all. So if you want to add in the more complex conditions as well, like for example, let's take a look at Fenari's Gambit, which is a tier 3 adventure that I wrote before, quite a while ago. And if you want to take a look at that, there's also a win condition that's very specific to the final encounter. So give the module a read if you have the chance. And I'm not gonna talk about spoilers on stream, but yeah. So you can always PM me at some point in time if you're curious about what happens in that module. Okay, so I'm gonna skip from the questions that Firon's asked to Trombe for a little bit. Are you able to create a new stat block for creatures that aren't in domains Arcfey? The short answer is no, because in Adventurers League, very specifically in the guidelines for writing a Dungeoncraft module, and I'm just gonna paste the list of the Dungeoncraft module guidelines onto the chat for just a little bit. So this might help everyone out a little bit. I'm just gonna post it here, so you can actually just download the link. Just click on that. That's the latest Wild Beyond the Witchlight Dungeoncraft guidelines. You will notice that it states very specifically that you can only pick from a selected list of creatures. So you can pick from Monster Manual, you can pick from some of the creatures in the Domain of Delight list. And if you pick from, say, Northern Kindness to Morphos or Volos, there's basically a very specific set of guidelines. And no new stat blocks can be created. All stat blocks must be used as is, but you can reflavor them, give them a different name, as long as you make a proper call out to the stat block in brackets. So I hope that answers the question, Trompe. Now I'm gonna jump back really quickly to Firon. I think where we last left off. From your experience in designing for modules, do you think a linear or complex story is more popular? Yep, that includes the Arcfey, that's right. So now let's take a quick look at complex or linear stories. So first of all, this comes down really to how you structure your story. So most of the time when you write an adventure, it's usually following the 3-act structure. So there's a beginning, which is a setup, the middle, which is where the meat and potatoes are, and the end, which is a conclusion, where you have your epic showdown, and then everyone wins, everyone has a good time, everyone goes home with loot and treasure, right? So so while I'm talking about that, let me just, I see Riz Wayne Ryan has mentioned something. Let me just jump over and quickly answer that, because we were all talking a little bit about stat blocks. So stat blocks minor details. The answer is no. So the DC document takes precedence over that. And that's the main thing about it. So you're not going to be able to just modify the stat block unnecessarily. And to begin with, if the Arcfey is a force of nature, if the Arcfey is more like a presence that controls the realm, and you're not going to go into combat with it, you don't really need a stat block. In fact, you don't even need to give anything that you're not going to fight a stat block at all. Because if you have a stat block, it assumes that you can fight the creature. And giving an NPC a magic item, I would say don't risk it. I don't encourage it. So typical guideline on that is if the magic item that's going to be seeded during the adventure exists and it's in the same scene as the character. So for example, you talk about an archmage who has a staff of power, for example. Yeah, so maybe the archmage has a staff of power, and the archmage has a staff of power on their stat block, but it's not called out in the monster entry. Then you're not going to be able to loot the item because it's not called out as a treasure in the adventure. So you need to take a look at the treasure listing in the adventure. There's always a section that says treasure. And don't forget that in Dungeoncraft, you are limited to what kind of treasure you can offer for the adventure itself. And yes, definitely your Archfey can be an environmental presence. I think I don't see a problem with that as long as they're so they can make their presence felt, and their presence can cause some interesting environmental effects, and I think that that's great and definitely something to think about because you don't have to actually fight them. They could be really like a spinny tsunami of fire or something, and it would be quite interesting. Yeah. So Firon, do not give NPCs magic items that should not exist in the adventure. That's gonna be a little bit of a problem. That's gonna make your module, not AL legal. Yeah, so that's something to think about. But if there is a magic item that's gonna be seated in the treasure entry and you want to have the NPC use that particular item, you can make a reference to that and say, hey, this item is found in the same scene. If you, as the DM, want the character to use that item, that's perfectly okay. Mm-hmm. Exactly, that's right. That's that's exactly correct. So so since you know that this exists, you should be very, very careful about it and try not to make a mess of that when you're writing your own story. Yeah. So I hope that clarifies. And just now we were talking a little bit about linear and complex stories. Linearity in a story is usually good if you are fresh to writing for D&D, and I think that a lot of people, a lot of DMs actually appreciate linear adventures. So I have a really, really bad habit, and I think a lot of DMs know for a fact that I write very complex adventures. It's really tough to prepare for a lot of the adventures I write. And I acknowledge that because when I write my adventures, I write it with the assumption that, hey, I'm going to be able to run this. But I also know for a fact that it can be tough for other DMs to prepare for it, which is why I have a cheat sheet as part of my packages for my work that I sell on DM's Guild. And generally, I would say having a adventure that follows the standard formula of the 3x structure is great. Um, 3x structure is always good, a beginning, a middle, and an end. You need a compelling story. I think compelling story, a compelling call to action, a reason for the players to be there doing what they're doing, or for the DMs to pull the characters in. I think that's a lot more important. Yeah, so you don't necessarily need a complex story, but you do need to have a tangible and clear reason for the characters to be involved. So the characters need to have a stake in the adventure. And when you write the story, you must make sure that, this is justified throughout the entirety of the adventure itself. I think that's really important. So if you don't have that, the first thing you're gonna ask yourself, and I'm gonna ask you as well, if I ever run your story, is what's in it for me? Why am I playing this adventure? It cannot be because I'm here for a loot run, right? This is not like playing, SKT 12, the 12th chapter of Storm King's Thunder, or playing the Manchun chapter of Dragon Heist. So, you know, that's how it is. So you really want to make sure that there's a compelling reason for your story to exist. And that's definitely a lot more important. And whether it's linear or not, it's not going to be a big deal. Maybe I think maybe what you mean rather than linear or not linear for the story is whether it's railroady or not. If the story is overly or so what you're saying is, what if you're to make a niche specifically hunting for players who characters have the reason to participate in the quest? I would say that you're basically making too narrow an audience for your writing. And if you want to do that, maybe you want to run that as an author only instead of publishing it officially for Adventurers League. If you want to get it published on DM's Guild, you want to hit a more broad-based audience. Yeah, I think that's a little bit more important. Hitting a more broad-based audience also gives you more exposure for your work, and you get a more chance to get better feedback as well, because you definitely want people to run your adventure and to review your adventure and let you know, where you did well and where you fell short. Yeah. So if you're going for too small of a niche, it's going to be really, really tough for you to get your adventure out there, and then you're going to sell less than 20 copies, and that's going to be a waste of your time, and it's not going to be so good. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's true. A couple of optional scenes to be able to adjust playtime. Yeah, that's always the first step. And I would say that coming up with optional chapters or optional scenarios, optional encounters is something that I really like to do. I first started experimenting a little bit with that in the Way Stop, where I had some thematically appropriate encounters that take place throughout a timeline, and the players had so many ways of hitting the endings that the Way Stop ended up with 8 different endings. It's just like how the Adventure with Cats that I'm writing, Cat's Paws, is it currently has about maybe 4 to 5 different endings. One of them being a secret ending, and well, players are definitely gonna be given the opportunity to explore every facet of the story by playing it multiple times. So there's a bit of replayability and a bit of extra value there as well. So yeah, I would say rather than making your story overly complex, start by telling a good, tangible, clear, and coherent story first. And if you want to learn how to experiment and write different things, and build a more, I guess, more interesting encounters and ways to tell your story, do that when you have established yourself as a fairly well-known writer, because first you need to know the rules to break the rules, and subsequently you need to have a good following and a good branding for people to try with your more experimental product. Yeah, because that way you have the credibility, people are going to be more interested to check it out. So that's a bit of the marketing side of things. Yeah, and finally, how to make combat deadly with just 2 monsters without locking the players away from their turns. So this is a bit about encounter design. Depending on the kind of monsters that you use, you know for a fact that action economy is typically going to be scaled in favor of the players. Why? Because there are more players than there are monsters in most encounters. So if you have a solo boss monster, for example, and you have a group of players that, they have 6 players or 7 players, and all of them are variant human, crossbow expert, sharpshooter characters, right? And they're all battle master fighters. And you're running a level 1 adventure, and you have a CR3 as your final boss. What's going to happen is that everyone's just going to come in, they're going to run and gun, and they're just going to shoot down your boss before your boss gets to take a turn. Because why? Crossbow expert gives you a single attack, a bonus action attack. Battle master gives you better precision dice, so you get a chance to roll and make your attacks more accurate. And if you're a sharpshooter, there's a +10 to your static damage. And with 2 attacks with that, your characters are probably going to be doing a minimum of like 27 or 28 points of damage per turn, and that's more than enough to eradicate. It's going to just delete your boss from the face of existence. So action economy is a big thing. If you are worried about action economy, look at creatures that have legendary actions, and you may want to consider those creatures as viable boss monsters. At the same time, environment effects are great. Designing your arena, basically designing the area that they're fighting in. What can you use the surroundings for? Like if the boss is really high up on a pedestal and is able to cast spells down from a distance, and the players are not able to retaliate as well, then that's a good opportunity for you to give your boss a little bit more survivability. Or if you have mooks, if you have cover, if you have things that require movement skills or specific actions, so that you could overwhelm the boss. So like, buttons and puzzles that you can press along the way while during the encounter. So that's one thing to think about as well, so that they can have a bit more interactivity as well, rather than just, rolling your attack rolls and, throwing damage spells and stuff like that. So think a little bit about that. It's really about making the combat and the experience more interesting for the players. Remember, the players are the heroes, the stars of the show. They are supposed to win. So really, really all about designing concept. What about for lower tiers? Most legendary action monsters in official material are higher CR. That is true, and that is usually the case. But if you think about it this way, challenge rating is not a big deal. Um, you should always be looking at thematically appropriate monsters. And if they are thematically appropriate, it's really, really more interesting as opposed to, using the CR calculation method. Like most of the time, I talk about designing a challenge, designing. It's really about encounter design. It's not about balancing, the XP ratio for this creature versus the XP ratio of another creature, or using the silly formula that's recommended in the Dungeon Master's Guide about how you have XP values and XP weightage and all that stuff. It's not about that. It's about creating an optimal experience, and I think that really matters a lot. So pick a creature that's thematically appropriate, and I talk about thematically appropriate all the time because that's really what matters. Yeah, it's about designing the best experience you can for your players and for the people that you're writing for. So it's okay to be a bit more challenging, and if you want to think about it from a gameplay and balance perspective, um, yeah, using the environment, using creatures. In fact, creatures can be dealt with by players as long as the characters are reasonably optimized. And even for a not so optimized group of players, let's say, for example, if the players are generally fairly average players or fairly above average players, who have fairly balanced characters but maybe not too many magic items, you don't have to worry about that as well. One thing I really dislike about the way that some of the adventures design their encounters is that they're really just slugfest. There's like it's really about calculating your hit points versus their hit points. It's really, really irritating. So you don't want that. You want interesting environmental effects. You want interesting maps. You want interesting concepts you can play with. And think about using spellcasters. Spellcasters are always fun. Combat should always happen in more elaborate circumstances. It's a little bit more for the DM to keep track of, especially at higher tiers. But remember that at higher tiers, they have all sorts of abilities as well that they can bring to bear. They have a lot of spells and magical items that are available to them, and they can really change the face of an encounter. So think about it. If a character has like maybe, a Durin's Instant Fortress or a Cube of Force, that really changes the dynamics of the encounter. So that's one of the ways that you can work around your encounter design. So does that help to answer your question, Donut? Yep, so let's see. Can I create my own effects in my domain that suit the story? Yes, you certainly can. I think you can definitely work out some flavor effects for your setting, for your domain, as long as they're not overly complicated. I think that one of the biggest problems with running adventures is that sometimes DMs get very overwhelmed. So if you have things that overly complicate matters, it's going to be a little tough. So like writing a Red War module, we had a lot of environmental effects. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the Red War modules because that's going to be a bit of spoiler if you haven't played any Red War adventures. But things like wild magic and stuff like that are probably okay. There's basically some precedents set for it, so you can definitely use that. And I don't think that there should be an issue with it. Just be mindful of writing too many effects in that overwhelm the DM and makes it difficult for the game to be run smoothly. Yeah. So for potentially off topic, advice for players who want to start DMing but has little D&D knowledge and experience. So first of all, I'm gonna say you don't need a whole lot of experience to start DMing, but experience definitely helps. It's a lot more important to be able to understand how to tell a good story. And being able to tell a good story, I think, is the most critical part. So if you are the most boring DM ever, who's really good with mechanics, but you're not able to describe a scene in such a way that it's evocative and interesting for your players, you're gonna lose your players. So hey, even if you're a walking rules encyclopedia, but you're not able to convey what the players see, what the players feel, what the players can interact with, that's not gonna be so good. So if you want to start DMing, I think that taking the first step is the most important. If you don't have access to the Dungeon Master's Guide, you might want to take a quick look at that. It's not a bad book to have, but here's a secret. I never looked at the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, at the first time when I started playing 5th edition. So, in fact, I haven't even really looked at the player's handbook very much at all, unless I really needed to refer to something very obscure. Because why? I guess I have the experience because I've been playing for a really long time now, and everything becomes very intuitive. But if you're completely new, your first book that you need to have on hand should be the player's handbook. Look at the player's handbook first, and then look at the adventures that you intend to run, and start breaking it up. Start compartmentalizing the adventures. Um, think about it as if you were directing a film, because that's how I think about it. This is not necessarily the best approach, but for myself, I found that what works for me is that I think about running an adventure as if I were directing a show. Like again, like because of my film background, right? So um, I think about it as if I were gonna tell a story on screen. What the characters are the actors, they're the stars of the show. How can I make this visually interesting and how can I make this compelling for the characters? So in scene one, what do they see? What do they hear? What do they experience? Who's the person that gives them the call to action? This is the inciting incident. And this is the point that propels them into the rest of the adventure. Yeah, so as far as possible as well, don't worry too much about the dice rolls. Don't worry too much about the mechanics. I'm going to tell you all a little secret right now. At the end of the day, the dice do not matter at all. The dice don't matter. They're not so important as long as you're telling a great story. As a DM, the trick is to tell a story where the players are always on the edge of their seats, where they always think that they're a few steps away from danger. This keeps them excited, this keeps them pulled in, and whatever you have behind the table, whatever dice you roll, that's for you to know and for the players to find out. And if you have played at my table before, I always say that's for me to know and for you to find out very, very often. Some of the best adventures I would say you can try is I'm gonna say the starter kit, Lost Mine of Phandelver. It's really good because it covers all the bases. And if you're interested to give that a go, definitely go check it out. Lost Mine of Phandelver is an excellent resource because it brings you right into the adventure. It actually teaches you all the basics. And if you have ever taken any screenwriting classes or whatever, you'll very quickly realize when you're analyzing the adventure that Lost Mine is probably one of the best adventures ever written because there's a very clear beginning, a very clear middle, and a very clear end. And there are some optional encounters as well. And everything is neatly telegraphed. So players are taught every little tip and trick that they need to do to be able to survive future encounters, and DMs as well. You're eased into the DMing seat. So that's great. Um, yeah, so give that a try. Give it a look. So Ting mentioned that there are some triple C's out there that are pretty good for one shots. Yeah, I would say so. In fact, one of my favorites, one of my favorites as well is Cellar of Death. I really like Cellar of Death because it covers all three pillars of play. And I believe that if you were looking at something a little more handy as well, Harriet and Hillsfar is pretty good too. some portions of that are pretty good. There's some good roleplay elements. Some depends on which of the mini scenarios you pick. And if you were also looking at something that's a little bit more straightforward, um, Defiance and Plan is pretty decent. Season 8 had a really good one in Once in Waterdeep. So Once in Waterdeep was actually pretty fun as well. It's really good for easing you in, and there's a lot of role playing elements there that will get players, practicing their role play, and that's great. There's some improv involved, and I really like it as well. Yeah. So that's that for beginner adventures and getting into DMing. Of course, if you were a little bit more interested in understanding the mechanics of the game, then you should definitely try to play more as well. I think one of the challenges that I've seen is that there are many DMs that I guess simply don't play enough. And being behind the DM seat means that you don't get to play a whole lot. And if you're not keeping up to date about the latest rules changes or about how people at your tables might act or play, then you're just gonna fall behind. Yeah, definitely play games as well as run games because understanding things from the player perspective is just as important. Unfortunately, I'm a forever DM most of the time. I don't get to play a whole lot, but I do have a couple games going where I play with some friends that I've had for many years, and I mean it's great. So yeah, and definitely if you are starting out, you don't have to worry too much about, I guess, the mechanics. Just get to learn the game a little better, and once you're more familiar with the game, you can keep moving from there. Yeah, and ultimately the end goal is to know how to run a tier 4 game, right? Because tier 4 adventures, that's the highest tier of play. That's the more complicated tier of play because there are so many options and so many spells available. So give it a try and just see what happens. And DMing a children's game is actually very interesting. And talking about DMing a children's game, if you want to DM a game kind of for children, but not, look at Lost Things, which is the introductory adventure for season 11, and it's really great. You get to play a child version of your character. It's amazing. It's fairly well written. I really like it. I think it's a good concept, and it really comes back to how you can develop a character as a with an honest sense of wonder, and that's something that I think a lot of adventurers lose and forget as they grow older. Because why? Everyone's gonna play a dark, edgy, a cloaked figure who's probably a rogue or a hexblade warlock who sits in the corner, just sits in the corner of a bar and just doesn't talk to any other character and just talks to the DM. So yeah, so think a little bit about it. Play more games, try more games, and then if you feel comfortable enough to run, just go for it. Run for your friends first, and after that, when you're a little bit more comfortable, you can consider running for public games. And it's perfectly okay to mess up as a DM. Don't worry too much about it because uh, no, the players will not know that you messed up if you're confident in your delivery. And I'll tell you another little secret. I make things up half the time whenever I run games, and it's perfectly okay. As long as you're following the story beats of whatever adventure you're running, and as long as everything falls into place at the very end, it's all good. So we were talking a little bit about the store that we have, and uh, well, we do have a web store, and if you're keen to pick up stuff from our store, you can always check it out. We have some Dungeons and Dragons books as well as miniatures and and it's all available. It's either on our Etsy or our Shopee, and you can find the links on the front page of our Twitch channel as well. So we have that at the bottom. So just scroll down to one of the panels, and you'll see that. So that's entirely possible. If you want to join, if you want to check it out, or you want to join us as a member, we do have some coupon codes and stuff like that as well. Mm-hmm. What's the recommended length of an average encounter? How many adventures would be appropriate for 2 hours versus 4 hours? Um, okay, this is actually a fairly interesting question here because when we talk about balance and stuff like that, for in terms of encounter length, I would say typically if you're writing a 2 hour adventure, you don't want to have too much combat. Most Adventurers League modules are written in such a way where it's usually keyed towards anywhere between 2 to 4 or 2 to 5 encounters, and there's a mix of combat, there's a mix of social, and there's a mix of exploration encounters. So it kind of hits all three pillars. Say typically, if you're talking about a social encounters are maybe 15 to 30 minutes. Exploration, maybe about 20 minutes to 30 minutes. Combat usually ends up being the longest for some reason or the other. Yeah, and when it comes to combat, I would say it depends on how complex you want it to be and how fast players take their turns and make their decisions. By my personal benchmark, I would say any combat that takes more than 3 turns is a bit of a drag. It's gonna take a bit too much time, and that's gonna eat into everything else. So you really want to know how to cut, combat and start and design it in such a way that it can be challenging to the players, but it's not gonna be too tedious and bog things down. So you need to know how to scale your hit points for the monsters and stuff like that. So combat typically maybe 20 to 30 minutes, sometimes 45 at the latest. So yeah, I would say 2 encounters for a tier for a tier 1 or tier 2 2 hour adventure, and for a tier 1 or tier 2 4 hour adventure, maybe no more than 3, at most 4, because you're going to want to factor in a bit of extra time as a buffer as well. Yeah, so 2 plus 1 is generally good. How long do most AL parties take during an average exploration section? It depends on how complex you want exploration to be. Some people have a bad habit of standing in front of a door and, trying really, really hard to determine if it's a mimic or not without actually touching the door. And if the player just takes too long and they're also timid about exploration, you're not going to get anywhere. So you as a DM need to kind of understand, what's the sweet spot as well. So exploration shouldn't be overly complex. And in fact, exploration is something that you can kind of gloss over. So you don't want to have too many skill checks gating your exploration as well. So like some modules, and I'm not gonna name names for those modules, but some modules have a rather bad habit of locking off whole chunks of content behind a single skill check. And that's all they call exploration. They don't give you alternative ways of solving a problem, or they don't, encourage players to be creative. And that's something you want to avoid. And those modules usually spend way too much time on exploration when they don't need to. Yeah, just let them know what really matters in the circumstances, describe things properly. Role-playing is great as part of this, and in fact, role-playing should be balanced with the rest of the pillars as well. So I would say try to have at least one encounter of every pillar in your adventure if possible. So that comes to about maybe 3 pillars. And if you are running a 2 hour adventure, maybe your RP pillar could be the call to action. And then there's a bit of an exploration, and then you end off with combat, because somehow or the other, people love to end off in combat. So the thing about the staircase in Uzdare, uh, the skill check is good to have, but it's always assumed, and this is something that I always tell DMs and players, is that given enough time, the players will succeed on a skill check. If you use a passive ability as well, passives are great. Passives actually cut back a lot of time wasted. So one of the things I like to do as well is when I'm running adventures, I'll tell people, hey, what's your passive perception? What is your passive investigation? And I work those things into my storytelling. And I use those as a way to make the story a bit more seamless. So rather than saying that they need to make a skill check to discover something that should be in plain sight to them because they have a passive perception of 15, I just weave it in and say that they see the item when they're given cursory glance around, perhaps. Yeah, so you don't actually need to make them roll if it's not required, and that will be a lot more seamless in their experience. Yeah. So how do we make our encounters so that they don't end too soon or too early or too late? So yeah. So you can't necessarily decide how long someone's going to run their adventure or their activity because why everything varies by different tables, right? And the table party composition, the kind of resources they have, how skilled and competent the players are. It's going to be tough, but typically you don't want to bog down too many encounters. So typically, if you're writing a tier 2 module, you definitely don't want to have um, something that's overly complex for the first two parts, and then maybe at the later end, at the conclusion and finale, you want something a little more complicated, a little bit more exciting. Yes, and some things can generally be summed up by using passives. So getting everyone's passives is great, and that's something I usually do as well. And if you ever play my tables, you'll know that I always ask for passive perception, passive investigation. Sometimes you may want passive insight as well, to get rid of unnecessary rolls where it comes to, say, opposed insight checks, depending. Yep. So you need to think a little bit about that as well. So one other thing that I normally do, and I think that this is something that it's an open secret, and something I always tell people, encounters end when I feel it's thematically appropriate for the encounter to end. And typically this means that encounters will last maybe 3 or so rounds, and sometimes if the players have an overwhelming advantage, there's really no need for you to keep going. You don't really have to, be finicky about it, make people spend, extra resources. If there's an overwhelming advantage and you know that the enemies are intelligent enough, and if they know that they're overwhelmed, they're gonna run away. Or if the party is on the back foot, if the party is not doing very well, then obviously you may want to do something to swing things in the favor of the party. So fudging your dice, keeping things behind the screen. This is all about the balance that you have as a DM. And yeah, it does come with practice. So you just need to know when it's thematically appropriate to end an encounter. See, again, thematically appropriate, right? So yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, combat is effectively over. You'll hear that a lot at my tables if you've played with me before. So you kind of can tell. And sometimes we just want the players to do something cool, and we'll wrap up the encounter because they did something cool that is gonna be overwhelming, and it's gonna swing everything in the favor of the players. Like if I'm gonna cast, say, prismatic wall, and I'm gonna blind all my enemies. Why do I need to go to the trouble of wasting extra time and playing out every single bit of damage, making the enemies roll every single extra die? when I've already locked down the enemy, blinded all of them. My party members can just run out, grab those enemies, and drag them through the wall, and those enemies are going to suffer all sorts of nasty effects. Why am I going to bother? Just do cool stuff. I mean, some DMs are going to be finicky about it. They're going to say, hey, why are you fudging all these dice? Why are you saying that, you can end combat when you feel it's the right time to end combat? Why do you say that the dice don't matter? But the truth is, you don't really have to worry too much about that, because your job as a DM is to really tell a good story. And even in Adventurers League, you are empowered as a game master to make the most appropriate decisions at the table to maximize the fun of everyone at the table, right? Yep, so you're there to tell a good story, you're there to make everyone have a good time. So don't prolong the pain. Don't make it extra, difficult for the players to succeed. So yeah, so I think we are gonna be talking just a little bit more, a couple more minutes before we wrap up. So if you have any other questions to ask, now's a great time to ask them. And like I said, we do have a store, and I'm gonna just post a link right here. You can go check out the Geekified store. This is a link tree, so you can check out our Etsy, our Shopee as well. And if you'd like to sign up for a member with us, and members do get some invites to author-only games and stuff like that, just check out the link. Okay, unrelated to the current line, is it alright to run draft versions of a DC intended to be released in the future? The answer is yes. You are running a playtest, and playtesting is a perfectly good way of ironing out the kinks in your Dungeoncraft. So if you would like to run a playtest, by all means go ahead and rustle up some friends and let them run through your game and give you some feedback. I think that's always good. So yeah, D&D enthusiasts from different communities may have different preferences. Other than making it accessible and easy to understand adventure, what else are the lowest common denominators when designing adventures for a wider audience instead of, say, for a particular region or play style? Okay, and isn't it also allowed to run by author until published? Okay, so definitely I would say lowest common denominator. It'll be really about ease of play, ease of access, graphics as well. Graphics is pretty important. Different styles will appeal to different audiences. Like a lot of the work I do has more anime style art, and I suppose that matters as well. Really write for the audience in your communities, and if you're writing for an international audience, I would say don't use overly complicated language, because not everyone's main language is going to be English. Like just as how I normally tell people, hey, keep it simple. Simple language is great. As long as you're coherent, I think that's more important. Yeah, and really, it's really all about writing coherent language. Is it also allowed to run by author until published? Yes, the answer is yes. You can run author-only DC adventures all the time. In fact, Cat's Paws is a author-only adventure, and I'm currently running it as by private bookings. And we are going to be doing that for quite a bit of time until I eventually publish it for DM's Guild. But that's going to be a little while away. Last one, are we able to give story awards like new familiars that are reskins of existing ones? The short answer is no. Story awards without mechanical benefits is great. Story awards that only apply to your domain of the light is great, but be careful about what you are allowed to do and what you are not allowed to do. So if you need to find out more, remember, I'm going to just post the links again. I'm going to post the two links. There are two important links here that will help you out. So you're going to need to look at the following. You're gonna need to look at the domain of the light resource, which gives you more information on how to publish your dungeon craft, as well as the Dungeoncraft Wild Beyond the Witchlight version 1.2. So these two files are absolutely essential, and they cover most of the things that you need to know as a dungeon craft designer. If you are also looking for advice and general feedback on your dungeon craft content, you can always get in touch. And there's also a little bit of extra help that I can offer if you are a member that subscribed with us. Um, you'll be given the opportunity to consult with us for some hours during a month, and we'll be happy to give you more feedback and pointers as well. So yeah, I hope that's covered a good amount of the information that you might need to help keep you going in your writing process. And I will definitely be talking a little bit more about my writing process and my workflow and things like that in future as well. I think we're probably going to be talking a little bit about writing maybe once every month, and I'll be doing a bit more of streaming about that, and maybe showing some previews of the work that we have on air in the months to come. Um, but yeah, so once again, thank you all so much for joining me today for the stream. And if you have any other questions for me, you can always look me up on Discord, or you can leave a message with us, and we'll be happy to answer them the next time. Uh, Please don't forget if you to like and our pages on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter, or follow us on Twitch, and also take a look at our stuff on Neo Tokyo Project. Yeah, so thank you so much everyone for hanging out today, and yeah, let's catch each other again in future. So have a good evening.